I'm having a lot of trouble with my video, so I'm sorry that I can't seem to turn it on. It's just not working. I tried 2 different video cameras and neither is working right now. So I'm just gonna, sorry, I'm gonna have to just, you're not gonna be able to see me, but you can hear me. But it just so happens that today's session features 3 presentations. So really, I'm not gonna be doing a lot of talking as much as our presenters will be. And then we'll have time for discussion. So sorry about the technical glitch. I just cannot figure out why I can't turn on the camera. Every time I try to do the whole thing freezes, and I have to step back into the Zoom and close out. So I'll unfortunately you'll just see my happy picture there from the top of Pergamon, and then my disembodied voice. But let me go ahead and share the screen. Hopefully it doesn't affect the screen sharing, whatever problems I'm having right now. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? Are we good? Okay.
Yes.
Great. All right. So I want to begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll start. We're moving into a section on New Testament theology and ethics. So kind of dealing with more of the ethical and moral issues, social issues as well, that were kind of the concerns of the early Christian community at the time of the New Testament. But these issues have theological implications for very live issues today. So I think that some of the struggles early church experiences with patriarchy and its particular form in the ancient world is indicative of some of the struggles we have with issues of toxic masculinity in our culture and unfortunately in the church, the role of women in leadership, and also the role of women in the household, which I would like to present to our group as a separate but related issue to women ministry. But I think that the exegesis and the text that we're exegeting are different for these 2 different issues. I don't collapse them into each other. I do think that women's unlimited roles, pastoral roles in the church is actually really much clearer in the New Testament. And where things get a little bit more difficult is when we talk about women in the Greco-Roman household. But the unlimited roles of women in and the New Testament support for that seems to me almost undeniable. And where things get a little bit less clear is how Paul engages with the patriarchy, but not so much the patriarchy within the church, but situations where Christians find themselves outside the church in the Greco-Roman household, and how are they supposed to function within that patriarchy? I think that's what's going on with the household codes. But let's begin with a word of prayer and ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance. Heavenly Father and gracious God, we thank you that you are a God who leads us, sustains us, encourages us, inspires us. And as we study your word and we go through issues that are dear to our heart and draw out a lot of emotions, pray that you might really, Lord, guide us with your gentle and shepherding Holy Spirit. Lord, shepherd us through these discussions and help us, Lord, to seek out what your word teaches so that we might be faithful to you and faithful to one another as brothers and sisters in the Lord. This we pray in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So why don't we begin with hopefully, well, I'm without my camera not working now. I'm kind of paranoid that all the technology is not going to be working, but I'm going to try. So I'm going to do I'm going to try. Have I shown this video to you? I can't remember. I'm getting confused between the Ignite class and this class sometimes. what has not been shown. Have you seen the Bill Mayer? Okay, so you have it. Okay, so let me preface this a little bit. I think it's a great introduction to the issue of critical debate in a liberal arts and university context. So Bill Mayer was invited to speak at the December graduation at UC Berkeley, and he makes a big joke about that it's December, not the big spring one. But apparently he said some controversial things on his show. He debated with some, we call an A-list movie star. I think it was, I forgot, Ben Affleck, that's right. And there was and he offended a lot of viewers, and some people asked that he not give the graduation speech at UC Berkeley. And what he does here, I think is really, really important, because he talks about the free speech movement. He talks about critical discourse. He talks about how one can disagree and yet be friends with those who debate and disagree with. And I think this is a good introduction to what I think is often assumed in an undergrad and graduate school setting. What does critical thinking mean in terms of, especially in a theological and ministry context? So we're gonna watch the video as kind of an intro. He makes a slightly crude joke, making fun of his own Jewish heritage, but because he's Jewish. So, but you'll know it when you hear it, and it's humorous, and hopefully that won't capture attention as much as some of the things he says about how to publicly disagree over issues that people don't see eye to eye with. I want to preface this because we are going to go into some tough topics. We can go into women in ministry and women at the home. And I think we read a very good excerpt of some of the history that took place in terms of where the church went wrong in allowing, I think, a toxic form of masculinity into its understanding of leadership. It didn't begin with, I keep wanting to say Born to be Wild. It's not whatever that book is. I keep forgetting the name of that book. But
Jesus Wild at Heart.
Wild at Heart. Yeah,
Wild at Heart.
Yeah, what's Born to be Wild? That's a lyric to a song. Anyway, yeah. So Wild at Heart, I think, is the apex. That's when you knew when a book like that was well received by many Christian men that something has gone wrong. So I think that for me, that was like the canary in the mine versus the first step. I think it just means that it's already gone too far. But you read that chapter because I think that's very cogent to the issues of how, if we let the world teach us what masculinity and femininity, what it means to be a man, woman is, we bring in also its toxic forms into the church. And I think that was the real challenge. What I want to do is I'll play the video, and hopefully this will work. I'm gonna share not this, but now I'm gonna share the Google. Where is that? The PDF. Come on, no, you're giving me such a hard time. Are you? Is this what I want to share? Okay, I think so. Hold on. There we are. Okay, can you see the screen? Or do you see? Let me see. I'm trying to share. Maybe it's better to exit out of this. Hold on. End slideshow. Okay, that's going to help. And then all we have is, can everyone see? Try this again. Your screen has paused. Stop
we see
share.
YouTube. We see.
Hold on.
YouTube, Max.
Oh yeah. Thank you. I'm trying to see if I can get this, because if I share the YouTube screen, it should includes the sound. Okay. All right, now I'm going to play and hopefully people can hear the sound. Let me know if you can't hear the sound. Okay, let me crank it up a little bit.
You got to unmute it, Max.
Oh, is it muted? Oh,
Muted
why,
in YouTube.
why is it muted? Okay.
Mine, no, it isn't. I see the thing right there. You're good.
It's not muted.
Okay,
It's not muted.
can you hear this?
No.
No.
You cannot hear it. Oh man.
You shared it.
Can somebody else try?
Okay, I think okay, I have a video version of it. Is this easy? Okay.
Somebody suggested to let someone else try, Max. If you let one of the other groups, like if you sent the link in the chat and let one of the other groups, maybe who's presenting first, someone could probably, you could share with someone and then
Okay,
they
well,
can play the video.
Sure, I can share the link. So I just shared it to the chat. Does someone want to try to share that for me?
Screen sharing is currently disabled.
Okay, now try. I also had the video separately. I did use a YouTube downloader to do it.
It's
Why don't
just
you
3
do-
minutes, right? We could also just watch it on our own really fast and then
Deliver
Okay.
the commencement speech
Okay,
for
this is great.
Berkeley's December graduation.
Christina.
A couple of months ago, I was asked to deliver the commencement speech for Berkeley's December graduation.
Thank
I was
you.
like, great. I love Berkeley. I'm off in December, and it'll be a sentimental journey. Who doesn't remember their graduation in December? But whatever, I'm happy to do it, because though I never attended Berkeley, I was very aware of their place in the American debate. On the far left, and in a country where the Democratic Party is sold out to the center and even the right, this is what is needed. This is why I wanted to accept this invitation. And they invited me because it was the 50th anniversary of something that is legendary on that campus, the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. I guess they don't teach irony in college anymore. And then a few weeks ago, Ben Affleck was on our show, and we had a discussion about Islam that I've had 1,001 nights with a lot of other people. But he's an A-list movie star, so now our very deep media started to care about it. It's always easy to do a story about somebody being mad at somebody. So when a few thousand people online who didn't have to do anything more than click a button, who didn't even go to Berkeley necessarily, wanted to be me to be disinvited as the commencement speaker, because, you know, I'm a racist. Right, because Islam is a race. You know, this is the level of logic we're dealing with. By the way, even Reza Aslan, my most strident critic, has gone to pains to say he doesn't think I'm a bigot. Here's what he said on HuffPost Live. He said, Bill Maher's not a bigot. I know him. We are friends. We hang out with each other backstage. He loves having me on the show, despite the fact that he disagrees with me on a lot of things, and that shows the kind of person that he is. If even my most respectable critic, who's a Muslim, says this, what leg does this protest have to stand on? He and I disagree on some stuff, but he's always welcome on this show. That's how it's done, kids. Whoever told you you only had to hear what didn't upset you? So anyway, the university has come down on my side, saying what I hoped they would say all along, which is that we're liberals. We're supposed to like free speech. So I want to come. I'm planning to come. I'm planning a trip to the Redwoods the next day. My only reservation in not coming is the argument that it will be a media circus and turn what should be a day about the graduates, which it should be, you, into something else. I don't want to do that. It's the only reason I would ever pull out. But let me say this to those students worried about that. I promise, this will be your day. This is a commencement speech. The issue is you. My speech is, I hope, going to be about you and whatever tips that I thought could I actually help you in life, because I already lived through it. That and my hunk about how Jewish women hate to have sex. So here's my final plea to you liberal, in the truest sense of the word, college students, not just at Berkeley, but all over the country. Please weigh in on this. My reputation isn't on the line. Yours is.
Thank you. Thank you. Whoever ran the video for me, thank you very much. I'm going to have to be a little bit better with the tech. I appreciated that. So let me pull up the screen, and then I'm going to talk about why I showed that clip in it right now. Let me see. I want that. Let's see. Let's do this. There's the screen here. Okay, hopefully, are people seeing the PowerPoint? I hope
Yes.
you are. Okay, great. But I can't see you. Where did everyone disappear to? Where's the? Okay, there it is. All right. Why is it shrunk? Like, okay, there you go. Okay, want to be able to see people's faces. All right. Let me So what I want to, so reason why, so I think one of the most important things that he shared was that, we're part of being a graduate student and in a liberal arts context, a university context, and engaging with theory and ideas is that we're bound to ultimately hear something that that doesn't make us feel good. He said, I think, I forgot his exact phrasing. He said that, what did he say? He said, that who said that you didn't have to hear something that would make you feel bad, or something that you didn't like to hear, something like that. He said that's not how learning works. And so in the whole point of being a university is that we're in our diversity and different opinions and even debates, we're united for a call for higher learning. And so to structure our discussion, not just for this module, but for any other remaining topics as we go forward, I think we're gonna have human sexuality as the next topic, and after that politics, all of which are controversial in its own end. I wanted to talk about the different levels of critical thinking and how we want to engage every author that we read and all the ideas or theories that are part of our discussion. So the three levels of critical thinking are sources and data, interpretation of the data, and the theory that ties all that together. And when we say that we're the one skill set that every seminarian has going through North Park is that they want to grow as a critical thinker, this is what it means. So whenever we encounter a theory or idea, we begin with what's the source of data fueling that idea? How reliable is the source? How comprehensive is any individual source or sum of sources in terms of the information it provides? Are we missing any or too much information to make a correct assessment? So the first level is data. But data, sometimes you can have a theory where the data is really good, but the researcher or author is interpreting that data wrongly or well, depends on the interpreter. So the next step is the interpretation of the data. If the data is good and valuable, how does a particular author or scholar interpret the data? The source could be reliable, but the author could be misinterpreting its significance. And so there's layer, that's the second layer. Then finally, as you have data and its interpretation, these things have to be constructed together or strung together into a working theory or narrative. So how does a particular scholar or school of thought string together the individual sources and their interpretation into an overall narrative or theory that ties together, let's say, the individual beads of information into a theoretical whole? And here's the tough part. Does the theory fall apart completely or just get weakened when one bead information is proven inaccurate? Or if the interpretation of that information is proven to be misinformed? So these are the different levels in which we engage big ideas. And so you walked through this, believe it or not, already when you did the Historical Paul Project. You worked through the sources. I had you look at commentaries and interpret the individual biblical texts. And then you had to deal with different theories or ideas about the Jerusalem collection. And based on your own research of the sources and interpreting those sources, you either agree with a particular idea, maybe found a couple ideas that were compatible, and maybe you came up with a hybrid form of a particular view of the Jerusalem collection, but you were engaging at all three levels of critical thinking. And so this is the kind of work that we want to do with any class you have at seminary, anyone. And it's what the kind of work that we want to do as we engage quote unquote hot topics and in Christian discourse. So now we're going to talk about Paul and women in the Greco-Roman household. And we're going to particularly deal with the issue of patriarchy. And I'm just going to give a brief intro, and then I'm going to let our presenters present. One of the things that I emphasize in this course is that the texts that speak to women in the home should be separate from texts that are discussed about women in ministry. I don't think it's the same issue. I actually think women in ministry and their unlimited roles, a much stronger case can be made that the New Testament supports pastoral leadership among women. I think the tough part is actually when we talk about women in the household. Some of the things are not as clear. And we do have some really tough texts because so while Paul says in Ephesians 5:21, men and women be subject to one another or mutually submissive to one another. But then he goes on to say, wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord, and husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And then in Colossians, we have wives, be subject to your husbands as fitting the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is your acceptable duty in the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. So we seem to have in Paul's discussion of how husbands, wives relate to each other, and how parents and children relate to each other, and on top of that, slaves and their masters. Because in a Greco-Roman household, slaves were part of the household. So together with with wives and husbands, we have Paul saying things like, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ. Render service with enthusiasm, but masters do the same. So render their service with enthusiasm as to the Lord and not to men and women. And masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both of you have the same master in heaven, and with him there's no impartiality. So what's going on here? Sometimes in one paragraph, Paul seems to affirm hierarchical relationships within the household. At the same time, he says in the same paragraph things that push against that hierarchy. How are we supposed to make sense of it? So what I would like to do is, these are some of the issues that are going to be brought up with the first issue. We have three issues today. Women in the Greco-Roman household, in particular the role of husbands and wives, and the issue of patriarchy in the household codes. You were asked to read an article by I. Howard Marshall, which I really like for this reason. He's very careful about what he thinks the text says and doesn't say. And he comes up with a term called love patriarchy that I'll let our presenters kind of unpack for us, because we wish Paul said end patriarchy, but he doesn't quite say it explicitly. So we have to wrestle with that. But at the same time, while we deal with that, we have another group that's going to deal with women in the Greco-Roman household, but talk about the issue of masculinity and gender as it was constructed in the Greco-Roman world, and whether Paul actually adopts those masculine models or not when he thinks about how men in leadership roles serve the church. And then we're going to talk about also, lastly, women in ministry roles, which is a separate set of text. So let's, I'm going to stop sharing right now. And I'm going to simply, okay, that's good. And then I think now I can hand over the reins to our first presenters.
Great. Lee's going to start us off.
Hello, everyone. Yeah. Today we are going to discuss Mutual Love by Howard Marshall. The topic is Woman in the Greco-Roman Household. So before we begin, I think the first thing we should do is to point out these dangerous claims, and also Dr. Lee mentioned one of them. It is dangerous to claim that a woman's position in ministry is the same as a woman's position in the household. So in Paul's writings, woman's position in household follows the patriarchal culture of the time. However, when it comes to ministry, we see that Paul frames a different position for women. And second of all, it is dangerous to claim that Paul's use of patriarchal setup validates it for all time. So Marshall says Paul wrote as he did about marriage because he didn't know any other form than patriarchal culture. So he did this with other relationships too, and he worked within the structures of patriarchy. So it is dangerous to claim that his usage of patriarchy is like useful and applicable to all time and all cultures. And we have to discuss some ancient perspective backgrounds before we begin, because these are so important. We see that in the ancient world, woman's authority of man as patriarch over wife and children and slaves is so accepted reality. So father as a patriarch had a much greater authority over sons and daughters, especially on the female individuals of the household. And the second important point is in the ancient world, woman viewed as a chattel, like as a possession. So in the ancient world, we see that there was a tendency for a wife to be understood as her husband's possession. And since she was a possession of her husband, her position was to be faithful and be subject to and be submissive to her husband. And in terms of like, if in case of unfaithfulness to her husband, there was a punishment. For example, in the example of adultery, if a woman commits adultery, she gets punishment right away. But however, this is not the same in the example of man, because man is not possession, but woman is a possession in the ancient world. And the third important point is woman's subordinate place in the hierarchy. In the ancient world, Marshall says, it was assumed that women were inferior to the man. For this reason, her role was to be submissive and to obey her husband. And since Marshall discusses these two writings, Colossians and Ephesians, we are going to discuss some important points from these texts. The first thing Marshall points out is the lack of clarity in term submission. He thinks that Marshall argues that the actual nature of submission in Colossians is not explained or dictated by the passage, and there are differences between ages and between cultures. So he thinks that it should have been great if the word submission is explained more. And also Marshall points out that the expected nature of submission is explained here, like given here. And he says that the existing setup requires women to be submissive to the patriarch. So Paul sees, as he often does, the first line of Christian duty is to do what is expected in existing setup. And finally, in Colossians, the third point is according to Marshall, submission is balanced with love. Marshall believes that Paul balances the reality of submission with a reminder to the husbands that they must love their wife. Paul assumes the structure of patriarchalism, but qualifies it with love patriarchy. So Paul's understanding of patriarchy is really different from the understanding of ancient world's understanding of patriarchy. And when we come to Ephesians, we see some similarities between Colossians, and Marshall again thinks that in chapter 5, verse 21, there is a lack of clarity in terms of submission. The Greek word like hypotasomia. He says that the general command to submission is not particularized with reference to husbands or masters or parents. Like the general nature of submission is not clear in verse 21, he says. And the second thing is, again, submission was expected in the that world, in the world of Paul. He says what Paul is doing is to indicate the way wives should be submissive within a society where submission was expected. This is the same in the slave-master relationships too. And the third point in Ephesians is husband's love is expressed. So submission is expected. Submission was expected from wife, and on the other side, love was expected from husbands. Marshall claims that this passage too commands husband to love his wife in care and respect. This is another example of love patriarchalism, in which the traditional element of submission is wanted by the wife to the husband. However, this is a new form of submission because it requires husbands to show remarkable love to his wife. And Amy?
Yeah, so then we need to just really take a deep dive into what love patriarchy actually is. The marital relationship is clearly different than that between the parent-child or the slave and the master. And for Marshall, this reality really opens the door for a mutuality in the relationship. And Jesus himself sets the groundwork for this, and then Paul builds on it by encouraging mutual love between believers, and that would clearly extend to the marital relationship. So love patriarchy is treating the wife as an equal partner through loving decisions, and in effect, this posture of the husband to consider and be concerned with his wife and make decisions alongside her is egalitarian in practice, though maybe not in name. It contextualizes Christian mutuality, a la Galatians 3, you're all one in Christ Jesus, within the marriage relationship, which carries all kinds of cultural patriarchal household expectations with it. It also leads toward mutuality and egalitarianism, but it's not quite there. It's just like that first step toward those positions. And this leads into what love patriarchy is actually not. So it's not simply tossing out the patriarchal context of the early church, Jewish and Greco-Roman, but while it leads that way and it can be applied that way today, that really wasn't what Paul was explicitly saying. And Marshall does believe that Paul's leading in this way, just as he was leading away from slavery. So why not just go there? And one reason that Marshall gives for that is that this idea would be applied both in Christian marriage, where both partners are Christians, and in non-Christian marriage, where one partner is a Christian. So love patriarchy also honors the existing structure in part so that spouses can be excellent witnesses to their non-believing spouses. And that was Marshall's point there. So, whoops, back up one, I think, Ollie. I think it's back one. Yeah, there we go. So ultimately, this statement is really what Marshall is getting at, that mutual love transcends submission. This mutual love that Paul calls for in a marital relationship is still within the patriarchal context, but Paul's emphasis on mutual love ultimately transcends the idea of submission and obedience and points to something both higher and better. So then where do we go from here from a pastoral and theological kind of standpoint? And the first thing is one really large pastoral kind of thought that we had was that we need to define our terms, particularly the term of submission, really defining what submission looks like today and defining it well. Submission was seen by Paul through the lens of the patriarchal system, but we need to ask ourselves, does Paul's teaching not only require that people fulfill the requirements of the social structures in which they find themselves, but also mandate these structures themselves? Or does scripture itself lead us to adopt different structures from those prevalent in the first century, just as we have seen to be the case with children's slavery and government? And that's a quote straight out of the Marshall article. So ultimately, we have to recognize that mutual love transcends submission. And the basic translatable qualities are loving and seeking to please one's partner. And this means that you care for your partner and you're willing to sacrifice on their behalf. And really just that love cares for the partner and does not make unreasonable demands and is willing to endure sacrifice for the sake of the partner. And that is paramount. Marshall's words again there. So the second pastoral implication here is to recognize the differences of age, of culture, of individual situation. And by recognizing these different cultural perspectives, that different cultural perspectives have different modern applicational implications for these relational guidelines, then we actually can approach this in a way that matters. This includes paying attention to different ages, different cultures, different individual situations, and demonstrating a sensitivity to that. So if you end up with one broad stroke of what marriage will look like, it doesn't leave room for how your culture sees the marriage relationship or age dynamics or individual situations. We had one of our members, when she had an example of this, and when she was growing up, she had a really good friend whose mom was Chinese and the dad was white. And the mom's greatest value was that she showed and teaching her kids in the way that she saw that she saw marriage, and that was honor. You honored your ancestry, your elders, your parents, and your relationships. But the father saw submission as mutual love. Honor was the way in which you showed your love. So it was very different perspectives, and yet kind of reaching the same aim. So really recognizing the differences and how into defining and living out practically submission. So we wanted to kind of end on maybe broadening the theological implications here. And so the last slide, we have a quote from Marshall that we'd like to just kind of dwell on for a second. But the deeper application is made in light of the gospel and in recognition that the gospel pushes us on to a fuller understanding, while the new situations in which we live require assistant readers and writers alike. And so we just wonder, well, while it does follow from Marshall's discussion of women in the household, we think that this is actually a great way to pay attention to a larger theological point when it comes to reading from the perspective of cultural and social location, both of the author of the text and the modern reader. We thought it was kind of an excellent reminder that the Word of God is alive and powerful, and that the Holy Spirit still reveals. So there are a couple, another quote, another response to this quote: the procedure is emphatically not a means of getting rid of the scriptural passages that contemporary readers may happen not to like. That's not what this is about. But the combination of searching for basic theological and ethical principles, interpreting the individual passages in light of scripture as a whole, and recognizing that there is progress in revelation is a method of interpretation that's based on the Bible itself. So not only are we looking at women in the household, but also the method of looking at the scriptures themselves, and really taking into account the fact that there are going to be cultural differences that actually need to be taken into account. And I think we can leave it there for now and let someone else have a turn.
Thank you very much. So I wanted so I'm going to press the presenters a little bit, because you left me with a question unanswered. And you don't have to answer this question in full. It could be a basis for a class discussion right now. So I want the first responders to be the presenters. So, I mean, can you just elaborate more how within love patriarchy, that's egalitarianism in practice? I didn't quite follow the logic from love patriarchy to egalitarian in practice. What do you mean by egalitarian in practice? That or that mutual submission should be egalitarian in practice, or love patriarchy is a form, can provide space for egalitarianism in practice? I don't necessarily disagree with that statement, but I feel like you launched it without really expounding on how Paul gives room for that in the household codes. Can you elaborate? And then also, I do want to send that to the whole class, maybe we can put it this way: how does love nullify the patriarchy? I think that's what. So patriarchy is there; you can't get rid of it. I think the whole thing about Paul is that we can nullify the patriarchy in the church, but as soon as you leave the church and you go out into the world and you enter a Greco-Roman household, and it might be a mixed Greco-Roman household, it might be some believers are there, some not. I think you can do more if the whole household has been won over to Christ, but you might have mixed members of the household, some who are in Christ and some who are not. And so the Greco-Roman household's patriarchy remains as the structure or organization there. And Paul would never want that in the church, but we're talking about stepping outside the church into the world. And the Greco-Roman household is what structures the Roman Empire. So under those, you can't change the system. How can you practice a Christian ethic in a system that seems to press against the Christian ethic? I think so. That's what's really at stake here. And I think our presenters did a great job in kind of painting that out. But could you explain a little bit more how love patriarchy or mutual submission provides space for egalitarianism in practice? I want that fleshed out a little bit more than what I heard. So I think that's a bold statement. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of talk about it more, expand on it.
Did you want to say
for
something?
me-
Okay.
Yeah.
Go
For
ahead.
me, it was also hard to understand what Marshall is trying to say, like egalitarian in practice.
Mm.
But as I understand it, it was like trying to, he was trying to say Paul softened the nature of patriarchy, and like his understanding of patriarchy was different from the ancient world, and he gave women another position, and he gave another responsibility to husband. So in this practice, in the egalitarian practice, the patriarchy was not the same as the ancient practice. So I think it was what I got.
Okay. Did anyone get something different, or would like to explain it a different way? I'm a little bit hesitant to think that Paul tries to give a different version of patriarchy and somehow pass that off as Christians. I'm a little bit careful not to do that. I think the things that he says actually works against the patriarchy. And if there's a standard definition of it in the ancient world, Paul's aware of it. And he seems to be saying a lot of things that press against it. So in other words, for someone who is trying to, in the patriarchal system, Paul seems to be saying a lot that kind of pulls the leg from underneath the system. So the love ethic, I think, is a really powerful one. I think you should all remember that the verb wives submit to your husbands, the verb there is not present in the Greek text. It's a carried over from verse 21. So what it says is that verse 21 says, submit to one another. And because the following verse doesn't have a verb, they're assuming that the verb is submit because it's used in verse 21. So wives submit. So wives ask to their husbands. That's literally what it says. So submit to one another. And then the second part is as wives to their husbands. So it's assumed that as wives, likewise, wives submit to your husbands. That's what it's assuming, but the verb's not there. So Paul does, I think, do a lot to push against the patriarchy, although he can't get rid of it. So how does love nullify, for lack of a, forgive the language, it makes impudent, and I mean just in the purely Webster dictionary form, makes powerless how patriarchy works. It just kind of, it doesn't destroy the patriarchy, it doesn't get rid of it, but it certainly, if you really follow what Paul says, it will actually, there's a lot going on where the patriarchy gets nullified, made impotent, made powerless. Have you thought about how love can do that from husband to wife?
Well, I think, if that Paul's talking about not using the power that's there.
Okay, great. Okay, so can you elaborate that a little bit more?
So, if you truly, so Paul's basically saying, like, if you truly love your wife, then you should just never use your power as given to you by the household codes, the Greco-Roman culture in which you live, the patriarchal system in which you find yourself. You don't use the power in that way.
Okay. So
or maybe not at all.
Yeah, I think Paul's thinking not at all. So remember that says, how does Christ love the church? He gave up the power and authority of the Godhead. He didn't give up the Godhead. He remained God. You always want to say that Christ remains God and he doesn't somehow lose his godness when he becomes a human being. He has two natures, fully God and fully man. But the power, privilege, and authority that comes with being God, he emptied himself of that, says Philippians 2. And he took on the nature of a servant. So what does love mean? It empties itself of power. That's how Christ loved the church. So when Paul says, wives, submit to your husband, and husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, it means that in the patriarchal system, the power is in the male. And he's telling husbands, don't you dare use it, because that's not how Christ loved the church. So we can't get rid of the patriarchy. Really, if you're going to reorganize society, you have to launch a military assault against the Roman Empire, overturn the emperor, and then you can come up with a theocracy that removes patriarchy. You can restructure the Greco-Roman world, but Paul's not going to launch a violent revolution to overthrow Rome. He has a bigger, he has a larger map in mind, an eschatological map that involves the kingdom of God reaching out to a broken and fallen world, let alone the Roman Empire. So he's not going to limit himself to something so small as that. But when the church, and I think that within the church, no Greek, no Jew, no male or female, he doesn't want nationalism, he doesn't want patronage, and he doesn't want patriarchy. So the church shouldn't, at least minimally in the church, this shouldn't be practiced. But you have this situation where what happens when a Christian slave goes back to his non-Christian household, or a wife finds herself in where the husband's not a believer, or the opposite, the husband's a believer and the wife is not. Parents are believers, children are, vice versa. Paul outlines where you can't change the system, but how do we live in a way where love nullifies the kind of relationships that do damage to one another? And how does love nullify patriarchy? So, and I think when Paul says, as Christ loves the church, that's an important qualification to how love operates. It should never exercise power to get one's own way. That's not love. And whatever Christ's understanding of power was, it meant emptying himself of it so that he could love us, the church, and redeem us. And so it's not, so I want to say this very carefully, it's not a fully satisfying answer. And R. Howard Marshall's right, as long as we don't go against the grain of the text, but go with the grain of the text, we can't limit ourselves to what Paul is doing, which is nullifying patriarchy. That's a great step. I think that, to me, makes a trajectory clear that if we have the power to actually change the structures of our world, we should get rid of the patriarchy, not just nullify it. But in Paul's day, I think all he can do is nullify. Given the fact that he lived in an age of empire, he didn't live in a democracy. We live in a democracy. We have men and women have the right to vote. We can attack patriarchy where it is, and we can demand that it be dissolved, dismantled. So I want to pause here, but are there any questions about how love patriarchy works? Because it's not a satisfying answer. And I do think that I. Howard Marshall is right. We have to go beyond what Paul's doing here when it comes to the household codes. Nullifying patriarchy is a radical start given its context, but it's not enough. I think we should get rid of the patriarchy if we can in today's world. And that is in the trajectory of the text, not against the grain of what Paul's saying here. But I'm wondering if people have questions or concerns about how the household code works. So I'm gonna.
Does this tie in with last week when we talked about how all of these like stern commands of Paul's were calls to the baptism promise? So you'd say that like he's calling people, men and women, husbands and wives, to be to identify with the cruciform Jesus. Like that's the highest level of love.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we go through all these individual topics, what we're going to see is our baptismal identity is constantly rehearsed, dying to self, living for Christ. What does that look like? So if people want to take Paul at his word in the household codes, even if the husband has authority structurally within the society one lives in, love demands you never use it. You just don't use it. It should be off the table. That's what love does. It never exerts power for one's gain. And so unfortunately, it doesn't get rid of the patriarchy, but I think it makes it impudent. So, and that's when I think what Marshall means when he says, so in practice, egalitarianism is what people experience, but it is within a patriarchal system that Paul doesn't get rid of.
Max, can you see when we have our hand up, or because you're not on screen, can you not?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can see you. Yes, but sometimes, I have to do it through the. Okay, so I don't see everyone all at once. I have page 1 and page 2. Is someone raising their hand? Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
me. I've had my hand up for about 10 minutes, but I've been like trying to politely wait and like.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
okay, sorry. No, please just speak up. So don't wait for your hand. Just go ahead and speak. And especially if you just say something, then I think your screen moves to the front of this of the view.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
but please go ahead.
I
now see that little hand. Now that I'm enlarged,
that little hand in the background.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, yeah, okay.
Please,
okay,
someone
sorry.
play Just As I Am. I'm coming forward.
Yes, thank you.
I just, as I'm listening to this conversation, I think one of the things that's coming to mind for me, and this really stood out in the article on page 195.
Okay.
Like I kind of had this soft spot for Paul where I was like, he shouldn't be expected to step outside the structures of his culture that he could not have foreseen the implications of. So like, I feel like when we're talking about love patriarchy, he understands that it's kind of a fruitless fight to try to destroy the structure of patriarchy in the culture, but that he can offer an alternative to how a Christian would function inside of the structure of patriarchy.
Yeah.
Or the same as with, parents and kids, or slaves and masters, right? And I guess to me, I'm just thinking of, he's giving us a model. Like I think of modern day places where Christians feel the need to take down cultural structures in order to win the cultural or the Christian position. And I think Paul is giving us a really important model to say, I know I'm not going to get rid of the patriarchy as a structure, but I can give you an alternate practice within the structure that is really going to catch people's attention. And so I feel like for me, that's the compelling piece. Like Paul could have never foreseen, like, he shouldn't be expected to step outside of his time and see the consequences of his teaching. And yes, we live in a different time where like no one's saying yay to patriarchy, let's do that. But I think we have other structures in our culture where I don't know that we're going to succeed in dismantling the structure, but we can surely tip the whole thing upside down and say, hey kids, this isn't how it's supposed to go. And so I don't know. That's just something that's coming to mind for me.
Thank you. Does anyone else feel comfortable with the idea of letting the structures take place, but interrelating with one another so radically within those structures that those structures don't have effect on the community that's being formed, that's in it? So I wrestle with that because I feel that Paul in Ancient Empire couldn't get rid of the patriarchy, and his first barrier that he was really trying to work with was between Jew and Gentile. And had he lived long enough and not been martyred, he would have tackled slave and free person. And eventually, I think he would have also tackled male and female. I don't necessarily think that he thought one by one. These are simultaneous barriers that he tackled all at once in Galatians 3:28-29. But if I were to give what was Paul most effective in getting rid of, it was the Jew and Gentile barrier. But I felt like there's still a lot more work to be done with the other two. But I hear what you're saying, but a part of me is a little bit uncomfortable with letting structures that are oppressive, if left unchecked or not pressed against, kind of stay there. If Christians, of course, can press against it and not let that structure form them as they consciously and intentionally engage those structures. But why would we not want to change them? So that's my question to you, Michelle.
So
I giving a different example. Like,
okay.
I'm not gonna show up and say, everyone, let's take down patriarchy, and everyone goes, yes, let's do that.
Okay,
It starts by someone modeling that there's a different way to do it.
Okay.
And I think that's what Paul is saying. Like, hey, if we all start modeling a different way, that's how we take down the system. We don't start with, let's take down the system, and then. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know. Maybe I'm not making any sense.
I see what you're saying, Michelle, but I just want to push back a little bit too, because I think that's the prophetic work that we are supposed to do as Christians, is that we're supposed to call that out, and we're supposed to say, we got to take down the patriarchy, or we got to take down racism. Like, we are supposed to say those things, and we are supposed to say these structures are not godly. These structures are not what God had initially intended. And that is, I feel like that is part of our call, and that is part of our loving. And I still think that, what Jesus was doing was radical, right? He did all the things that nobody expected, yet he still did them. And I think Paul, as a disciple of Christ and someone who so much wanted to imitate Christ then, should also, I feel like he was a lot more radical than I think we're kind of giving him credit for. I think he's saying, yes, if you go into this is how you can live as somebody who is maybe not in the Christian context, who is not a believer of God, and this is how you can live. But I don't think that Paul's saying, let's just stay within the structure. I think he's like, let's just we got to flip everything down, because that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus flipped the whole idea of power and what is kingdom. And I feel like if Paul was 100% on board with Jesus, then I feel like that was Paul's aim at some point as well. Maybe it is not articulated in these verses per se, but I just think he was giving us a context for, if you are living in either a marriage or in a situation in a household where that person is not Christian and they are not going to empty themselves in love, then this is how you can live, to be that witness, right? But I don't know. I think it's not enough for us to just be a different model. I think part of us as Christians, our calling is to
to call it out and to change the structures and to flip those things upside down. Like, I feel like that's really part of what we should be doing.
I maybe didn't articulate it well, but I think we're saying the same thing from different sides. I guess what I worry about is people who see culture wars as the way to go. Like, let's just try to like take down the culture, right? And like, I think the way we dismantle cultural structures that are oppressive is by living in an upside down way as our means of saying, this is how I'm showing you this is possible. So now let's all do this together. Versus just saying like, let's just get rid of it. Like throw it out. Like you can just take it out like garbage. I don't think you can just like pick something up and move it. It takes a groundswell of people living in an alternate way to be
right. But if the culture of oppression and culture is killing people, like literally killing people, then I'm all for let's go dump it in the garbage. Because how is that acceptable as people who say that we love one another and that we believe that Christ's blood covers for all of us?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just don't think that's possible. I think it is not about culture wars when when people are dying and people are being killed. Like, I don't know what else, like, and if that is coming from even within the church itself, then what are you supposed to do? I think the only way is to be able to call that out. I think the only way is to be able to say something and not to just model.
Yeah, okay.
No, I agree.
Anyway,
but I'm saying like as individuals, like I personally, if it were just up to me, I don't have the ability to do away with an entirely like on my own. I don't have the ability to dismantle an entirely oppressive structure. I think the power comes when all of us together start collectively saying, we don't agree with this. We're not going along with this. So I think I'm questioning what is the way in which you undo what the culture says is normal.
Okay.
And I feel like that's what Paul's trying to answer.
Okay. So this is great. So that's a really good segue to kind of summing up what Phyllis and Michelle are saying here. So really, it's a matter of two different approaches. So what we see in the New Testament is a bottom-up approach, because you can't overthrow an empire without, just launching a revolution and taking up arms. And Paul's not that. For Paul, violence is off the table. So what we see with the early church is a bottom-up approach where when one by one, the church, so the world does its thing, but in the church at least, no patriarchy, no patronage, no nationalism. And the church lives an alternative lifestyle, and it bears witness to an alternative community made possible by the reality of God. As you win over one by one people from the Greco-Roman world into the church, one has to wonder, it's kind of like Jenga, that game Jenga? When you keep taking out blocks, how long does it take before the structure whole collapses? The New Testament church's approach is you win one person at a time into the church, and then how long does it take before the structure of Roman society implodes, because you keep winning over its members one by one. It's the Jenga approach to engaging fallen structures. You win over the individuals one by one into the church, and eventually the structure collapses as members move from the world into the church. But there is also, I think, an important work that the early church doesn't. The New Testament actually is not the best witness to. It's the Old Testament. So Oliver Donovan wrote this book called Desire of the Nations, and he analyzes Israel's theocracy. And his whole point is that if you're going to talk about engaging sinful structures systemically, the Old Testament is actually a better model for that than the New. The New is always from the bottom up in Age of Empire, but the old Israel was a nation and it had a theocracy, and it made a lot of mistakes. You can learn from both the mistakes and successes, the ideals and also what they didn't do. So the example he uses for is the idea of a jubilee. I'll just just really quickly, if you have to give back the land, the old land markers. Does anyone know what jubilee is? When you give back the old land markers, what does that mean every 50 years? Every year the land depreciates in value because eventually you have to give it back. Does that make sense? It's an ingenious way to understand land stewardship, that every year the land of my value goes down, not up. So I don't want to hoard or keep it. And so in place systemically was a system that if carried out to the full means that no one would ever be poor in Israel. Everyone would have something to eat. The failure of Israel as a theocracy was not the system, but actually the people who failed to actually live it out fully and faithfully. So we do have biblical warrants for engaging systems from top down. But I think, to be honest, that it might seem overwhelming for an individual person or even one church. And that's where we need kind of the wider body of Christ. There are going to be people who are particularly called and gifted who can see systemic issues and know how to engage them so that they get, especially if they're unjust systems, their dismantling can be done at a top-down legislative level. And so we have both models in the Old and New Testament, but the New Testament tends to focus on the bottom up because of the social location of the early church at that time. And it's really the Old Testament as a theocracy that gives us models for how to tackle the systemic issues from the top down. And so this was a great discussion. So I feel horrible that we're going to push forward, but I feel like we have to, otherwise we're not going to get to the material or to the rest of the presentation. So can I just highlight a couple of things? Let me I did want to mention that this is great. Why am I launching new apps? That's not what I want to do. Where is the share button? Okay. We're still on the share. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, let me just kind of say that. So again, this is where I would follow the trajectory of the text, but not necessarily. But then because we don't have something explicit from Paul, we do have something explicit from Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says to slaves, if you can gain your freedom, do it. He just says that in verse 7:21. But just in case you're stuck in the system, you can't, know that you're not really a slave, because every person in the Lord so whoever is called in the Lord as a slave is a free person. And those person who are quote unquote free out in the world, when they become Christian, they become a slave of Christ. So, when you were bought with a price, the one you serve really is the Lord, not human beings. Do not become slaves of human masters. So he says in 1 Corinthians 7, if you can get free from it, do it. If you can get out of the system. So if slaves were part of the Greco-Roman household, I do think that if women and men find themselves in a position to actually not just nullify the patriarchy, but they can actually get out of the system, dismantle it, not live in it. While he doesn't say that explicitly, since slaves are part of the Greco-Roman household, and he does say that slaves get out if you can. And this becomes a warrant for an engagement of slave systems and trying to dismantle them. I think it's possible that we can, as an analog, it's an analog, because Paul doesn't say explicitly that in the same situation with patriarchy. So for us, the Galatians 3:28, it's actually a really important text, and we can misread it if we don't read it as Paul does. When there is no longer Jew or Greek, that is against nationalism. When there is no longer slave or free, that's against patronage, which we just talked about. And when he says there's no longer male or female, he's fighting against patriarchy. He's saying at least in the church, none of these things should be there. And then he gives the household codes for a situation where you're outside the church and you can't control the social situation you're in. and it could even be a mixed non-believer believer household. This is my instructions to you to live in a thoroughly Christian way. And Paul, again, we want him to say more, but he doesn't. So I thought the presenter's description of women as chattel, that was actually quite shocking to read, but it's not wrong. It's just, you just laid it out there in the most shocking way possible. And it was really tough for me to read that. But to a certain degree, the Roman world was aware that women were not treated, were treated as property. And some people fought against it. Even so, in Catalyst's epigram, you actually have a satirist named Catullus who makes fun of Roman patriarchy. So this is exaggerated, and he's making fun of it. This is satire. But he says, when talking to a woman who's about to get married, a young woman, if she's ripe for marriage and she enters into wedlock, she's even dearer to her husband and less hateful to her parents. So I guess, you know, her value goes up when she gets married. So do not, and remember, this is satire. Catullus doesn't agree with this. He's satirizing, he's making fun of it. So do not reject such a husband, little girl, meaning that women married typically young, between 12 and 13 years old. It is not right to reject the man to whom your father and mother gave you. You must obey them. Your virginity is not yours, entirely yours. 1/3 belongs to your father, 1/3 to your mother, and only 1/3 to yourself. So here's the satire, here's the math. If your father has a third, your mother has a third, and those 2/3 go to the husband. And the bride only has a third. The husband has more ownership over her than the woman does over her own body. So don't fight against your parents who have surrendered to your husband a dowry and their rights over you. So that was the Roman world. And here's where I think Paul shines. So he does say the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. So that part that seems like patriarchy. But then he says in the next sentence, which never happens, in the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him, but also to his wife. That last part is pretty radical. So Paul uses the language of mutual submission in Ephesians and Colossians. He uses the language of mutual belonging when it comes to 1 Corinthians 7 of bodies. And so what I think what's happening is that, and then remember that in Ephesians 5, it's to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The verb submit is there. In verb 2, it literally says, wives as to your husbands, as to the Lord. And we're assuming that the word submit is a carryover from verse 21, but it's not there. And then husband loves your wives, Christ loved the church. So there's a difference between mutual belonging, mutual submission, a mutual giving up of rights so that the other might be, for the sake of the other, and equality. What I want to suggest is that Paul doesn't have a model for equality. That's not what he's thinking of. He actually wants to do more than what equality does. If people hang on, I have rights, the other person have rights, we both insist upon our rights, and they're equal rights, what we're going to end up with is division. That's what usually happens. And it seems that what Paul wants to argue for is a relinquishing of rights for the other, but that only works if the other party also relinquish their rights for the other person. If it's one-sided, it's unjust. But if it's mutual, then what it does is it creates unity. And so so what I would like to do is, before we take a break, and by the way, it's okay if we don't finish today. I would like to get the presentations all in, but next week is only one presentation group, one topic, and the whole class time does not have to fit within that session. anything we don't finish today spills over to next week, and then we have only one presentation scheduled, so it'll work out pretty nicely. So I just want you to know that we are on schedule, so let's not worry about the time so much. But I think the household codes, love patriarchy, is a non-ideal interim step toward no patriarchy. I would like to suggest the trajectory of Paul is, if you can get to no patriarchy, do it. But you might be in a situation where you can't. And we live in a democracy in North American context, but the church might find itself in a majority world context, and it's not a democracy. And they might find themselves in structures that they can't change. Then what do you do? What we can learn from the household codes is, if any member of a social body has more power than the other, the Christian ethic is you never leverage that power for self-gain. That power should be surrendered, jettisoned for the sake of loving someone else, because that's how Christ loved the church. I think that's that we can learn from the household codes. And so there is some real world life situations, as Michelle suggested here, because we might find ourselves in situations where we don't have the power to dismantle the structures in front of us. I think in a North American context, though, and in a democracy, we have more power than we think. Great. I fixed the camera. What a pain. Okay. Goodness, one of those nights. So is everyone back? Not yet. So we'll wait for people to trickle in. But got the camera back, which I'm really happy about. And I'm going to simply let the presenting group go ahead right away, which will be Michael, Aaron, and Jeffrey. So I'll just give a very short intro. Women in Ministry group. We might have to defer your presentation to next week. It'll be the first thing we do at the start of the class on Tuesday evening. Is that okay? I want to make sure that you're there. Like, I don't want to pick a time when, you know, so I saw thumbs up. So Laura said it was okay.
Yeah, honestly, it's such a great discussion that we're having so far. I don't want anyone to feel rushed or cut short. I'm not just saying that, like, legit.
Okay.
I don't think Christina's super heartbroken either, but I just.
Okay, so I just want to know it's okay with the presenting group for women in ministry that if you're the very first thing we do and we meet next Tuesday, is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. No problem.
Okay, then that means we can use this time to talk about the article on Paul's maternal masculinity and Kristen Dumais' powerful book, Jesus and John Wayne, which you only wrote a sample chapter 2. So I think everyone's back. So we'll start. So I think there's so much more to talk about. I should have created more space for this, but hopefully this will just give enough biblical foundation and a New Testament theological framework to have further discussions on an issue of women in the household and patriarchy. We're now moving into the topic of Greco-Roman views of masculinity. Some of them were, I would say we're not familiar with some forms of Greco-Roman forms of masculinity, paternity, femininity, and views of children. And so the nice thing about Grace Emmett's work is that it introduces to some of this and introduces to the reading of some primary sources. I thought that it was really good article in contrast to, or as a complement to Kristen Dumais' chapter on how toxic masculinity infiltrated the church. So if you have a chance, please read the whole book. It's actually very powerful. It is really helpful when you have a first-class historian tracing the modern church movement. And so Kristen Dumais does that. It's an excellent read. And I think it causes us to rethink that when we wed toxic forms of masculinity to what we think is Christian leadership, it could be really deadly. It could damage people. We have spiritual casualties. And one of the things I wanted people to get an idea of and I'll let the presenters go discuss this, is that I don't think Paul was tied to Greco-Roman forms of masculinity in his day. He seems to model a disregard for masculinity models as presented in his world. And he tries to and he wasn't afraid to use maternal imagery to talk about pastoral ministry. And I think that speaks to us theologically about, where are we going to draw our leadership models? I certainly hope it wouldn't be from toxic forms of masculinity derived from our culture, but leadership models, and not limited to just one of the two biological sexes, male and female. I think we have leadership models among women that we need to embrace. The maternal imagery was something that Paul was not afraid to use in his own, when he talks about loving his own congregation. So that's why I wanted you to read Grace Emmett, and she's a rising scholar. I think she's young, really young, but she wrote her book is already set for publication. So this article is a smaller version of a book that will eventually be published, maybe in a year or two's time. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Am I sharing? I can't even tell if I'm sharing now. Okay, I'm not even sharing. Am I sharing? Okay, yeah, okay, no, I'm not. Okay, good.
Okay, we are getting into what we have titled toxic masculinity. And we start off with Dumay's chapter of her greater book, which is looking at the ways that evangelicals in America have kind of slowly traded the Jesus that we kind of find in the Bible for kind of an American ideal of masculinity, and how this has kind of distorted theology and faith. And it's mostly her argument in the whole book kind of talks about the intentional choices that were made to preserve power for white evangelical men, and then kind of the fallout of that. And so in this chapter, we see the rise of hypermasculinity in the early 2000s, which was this kind of valorizing of militancy and violence in the expression of evangelical masculinity. And it starts by looking at John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, which paints God as this warrior and men as made in the image of that warrior God. He defines masculinity as aggression and not tenderness. It's militaristic, it's dangerous, it's heroic. And he has this phrase where God created men to long for a battle to fight, an adventure to live, and a beauty to rescue. That's kind of a core element in his book. And he writes this because of a conflict he sees in the culture, that the culture is seeking to make men safe and sensitive and manageable, essentially what he views as more feminine. And so he kind of dismisses Jesus's commands to turn the other cheek, because he believes that to pacify men is to emasculate them. And he holds up these kind of American culture ideals of or models of masculinity. Mostly it's like William Wallace from Braveheart, that movie. He's really excited about that. But then it's also like the American cowboy and Teddy Roosevelt and Indiana Jones and all of these kind of things. And so this main book is then followed by a series of books which kind of coincide with this political and cultural moment of 9/11 and the kind of the aftermath of that. And so the first of which is James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, and this notes that the key to understanding boys is testosterone, and he just laments the efforts to make boys feminized, emasculated, and wimpified is his language. I thought that was funny. Then it talks about Douglas Wilson's Future Men Raising Boys to Fight Giants, which is touted as basically a primer on militant masculinity. There's a lot that you can talk about this that's a little bit disturbing. The piece that hit me the hardest was that the husband's role is dominance. And he talks about how young suitors should cheerfully interfere with his future wife's plans. That one was a little rough. So then she talks about Steve Farrer's King Me, which just basically says we need more masculine men. Gordon Dalby's Healing the Masculine Soul. Boys need to be taught a vision of conflict and warfare is kind of the crux of that one. Paul Coughlin's No More Christian Nice Guy. It talks about men's anger and how this is not necessarily a bad thing, and how it can be or should be transformed into a redemptive force. And then she kind of finishes her chronology with David Murrow's Why Men Hate Going to Church. And this basically, I like her kind of, she dismisses it. It just piggybacks off everything else, and just says that the church should embrace danger. So all of these things come together and kind of create this Christian cultural movement where dads are leading initiation rites for sons, men's groups are involved in paintball wars and Braveheart games and those kind of things. And evangelicals kind of hop on what we'll just call the war train. And basically they favor military action in Iraq in much higher numbers than some of their peers. And so we kind of see this slow, subtle shift from maybe the image that even Eldridge was offering, that, women need to be this beauty that men fight for. But we see a shift from women being the beauty men are to fight for, instead to the nation being the beauty that men are meant to fight for. It kind of slips into this Christian nationalist view, where basically the manliest thing a man can do is to fight for one's country, whether that's physically, politically, or in the cultural wars. So strengths and weaknesses that we see in this, Dumay is super thorough in her case. She's drawing on all sorts of different authors and cultural things that are seen throughout that time period to kind of support her theory. And she does this with a very like chronological development of this militarized masculinity in the authors and cultures. She really, it's super easy to read, and she just kind of paints a narrative that you can follow really easily. Weakness, she exposes this toxic masculinity, but kind of leaves us wondering, what would be a healthy masculinity or corrective masculinity? That does not in her purview for this, but it kind of like names the problem and then leaves us going, okay, so now what? That's kind of to me. You're muted.
Oh yeah. So who's speaking? Is someone speaking right now? Oh,
but you're muted. It looks like.
Mike. Yeah, Mike.
Oh, you were unmuted for a minute and now you're muted again.
All right.
Now,
I hold
yes.
I hold the space key. I can talk. All right, great.
Start from the top, please, Mike.
Okay. Well, we're going to transition to the article by Emmett, the Apostle Paul's maternal masculinity. And so Jeffrey and I worked, well, Aaron, Jeffrey, and I all worked on these together. And so I feel like.
Oh, you're muted again. I don't know what's happening.
Sorry, I think I'm struggling with presenting and talking.
Mike, I'm not quite sure, but you're coming in and out of mute. Is there a setting, or is your signal weak and therefore your signal's muting you for some reason?
Actually, you can unmute him.
Actually, all I can say, all it allows me to do is ask to unmute. Okay, there it is.
Okay.
Good.
All right. I think I'm good now. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
It was automatically muting me every time I tried to unmute. So I don't know what that was about. So we're going to explore the Apostle Paul's maternal masculinity. Emmett explores 3 Pauline texts where he refers to himself or the other males with him in maternal language, in imagery and metaphor. Emmett makes the claim that Paul's non-uniform use of maternal language reflects shifting views on masculinity and gender construction. And Max was alluding to that earlier. And so a significant context as we start that, and we could see that Paul isn't buying into the hegemonic masculinity, the practice that legitimizes men's dominance and rule in society. It attempts to justify the subordination of women in certain ways of being a man that is not ideal. And in particular, masculinity wasn't fully realized. You had to continue to adhere to the honor system that made you more masculine to become the most masculine version you could be. And so there was a part where it wasn't just being male, you also had to buy into the reinforced value. So hegemonic masculinity was exercised by a majority of men in the ancient world to uphold their masculinity. It was paramount for men to avoid any effeminate or womanish behavior. If not, they would be in jeopardy to lose their masculine status or have a lower status. And so the 3 texts that I can't get, there we go. The first text where Paul, and he includes Silvanus and Timothy as a nursing mother. So that's the first metaphor that we encounter, and that's in 1 Thessalonians 2, 5-8. So Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy relate to the Thessalonians as a nursing mother with her own children. So there's discussion about how being a nurse could be an enslaved nurse, but the language used, I'm trusting what Emmett said, but that this was a nursing mother with her own children. And so the metaphor connects a strong image to apostolic authority and hierarchy. There's a definite hierarchical relationship that is being driven in the metaphor. And the modeling the three leaders in emptying themselves like nursing mothers is to form a community modeled on self-giving. So this was a very positive use of being a nursing mother, and they're cheering for the Thessalonians to keep going, and they want to model, as they have emptied themselves as nursing mothers, they want the church to form in the same way, to be selfless leaders. The second text that Emmett looked at was, again, Paul is a nursing mother in 1 Corinthians. And this is a lot different tone. The metaphor changes radically from nurturing to frustrated, corrective, and authoritative. The Corinthians are in need of proper formation. They've had lots of nursing and they're not well formed. The factions are indicators of a pneumaless living. So without spirit, and the factions are present, they have not progressed past very basic things. So Paul is asserting, as a nursing mother, he has the best formation possible for them. He also displays frustration of their lack of formation and is ready to move them along. And so the use of rhetoric of a male nursing with his own milk was referenced by Quintilian as teachers providing formative instruction. So there was some common rhetoric out there of similar use of metaphor in regard to teaching. But again, this is again, there's authority and hierarchy, but it emphasized what is needed is the right nutrients, and Paul was saying he had that. And so the last is in Galatians. Paul is a birthing or pregnant mother. This is far more complicated metaphor. One highlight, though, would be attaching how birth is connected to emerging eras or apostolic language, like the birth of a new era. So there's a movement Paul is rooting for in the Galatian church. The broader emphasis of the passage is on the spirit imparted heritage, not through circumcision. And so and that if they followed circumcision, there's a little bit, what makes it complicated in my understanding is that they would be taking the way of Hagar, and that's a subordinate, enslaved position. But one super positive part of this metaphor is it highlights active maternity and honors the toil, labor, pain, and struggle of bringing a child into this world. This is a model Paul is holding up for apostolic leadership, and he uses maternal imagery. And so, and this again would be a sharp contrast from the view of women as passive. And so this is Paul is giving an active role. I believe Emmett did not say it did a lot positive for women, but I got a little lost in some of this. So Emmett asserts some conclusions. Emmett asserts the maternal imagery implies gender flexibility in Paul. He's operating in this hegemonious system, but he is employing maternal imagery for his own leadership. So he constructs his masculinity in metaphorical drag, is what she described that as. Paul does assume connection to lower social status. So he is, by using this imagery, he is also in some ways threatening his own masculinity, or at least could be perceived as that. And then all maternal metaphors imply, I can't read the very bottom.
A message of hierarchy.
Oh, a message of hierarchy. So all these metaphors imply a message of hierarchy. So that was a common thing that I observed in the text and her engagement with them. Some strengths and weaknesses. Strengths, Emmett reinforces an active and substantive femininity by exploring Paul's use of active and formative images of women. So all of the imagery was significant in the formation of the church and people. Emmett explores a specific topic, maternal citations by Paul. And she does this with really faithful interpretive work and seems to evade what I was anticipating, a bias confirmation because of the focus. In this context, there's lots of other family metaphors used, and so she really focuses in on the maternal ones, but she really does a great job just letting the text say what it says. Emmett was very thorough in fully vetting her theory. For me, for all of us on our team, the weeds were prevalent. It was a little hard for us to follow all of her themes as she explored them. It was easy to lose some of her where she was taking things. She seems to excel at presenting evidence and does not seem to be clarifying an argument or position to consider in a strong sense. The focus of the paper was on maternal language, use and imagery. However, Paul also references many other relational metaphors. The paper is admittedly focused, but struggles to return the conversation to the map and the broader metaphors present. So some of our pastoral implications for both articles was really emphasize. Actually, Erin, do you want to take some of these? And then
Yeah.
We didn't talk to. Okay.
So we had talked about how kind of the masculinity and femininity reflect the Imago Dei, the image of God, and kind of coming together. And we can't have just one piece or the other. That these two pieces are part of the image of God, and we can kind of use this in our connection with congregations and reassure our congregations that both aspects are vital to understanding what the image of God is, and then how do we live into that in community particularly.
Another implication that we explored was our cultures are very steeped with unequal expressions of humanity and gender to this day. And, you know, the Jesus and John Wayne article, that's recent, but there's, 2 millennia and longer of patriarchy. We need to examine what is valorized and explore where these ideas come from. In particular, the emerging generation seems to display an increased level of distress for any institution and seems to display significant allergy to anything that is artificially constructed, especially gender roles and norms. So I think pastorally, it's helpful to loosen with the grain some of the gender normative roles, honor codes, expectations. And we don't want to artificially prop up that which doesn't belong. But the positive side would be to encourage individuals and our communities to be filled with strong, healthy people trusting God and living into his call in their lives. Emphasizing exploring Genesis 1 and 2 is a good starting point. There is no hierarchy in Genesis 2. These are 2 Jim Bruckner quotes again. There is no hierarchy in Genesis 2, and the ideal possibility for life is to trust God as God. And so moving back toward the intent to create healthy masculinity and femininity.
And then on this last one, this was Jeffrey's. Did you understand what his point was on that one?
Well, he was really struck by the exhortation to live by the Spirit, and in the 1 Corinthians chastisement, they had received what they needed, but they were no longer living by the Spirit. And so Jeffrey really wanted to emphasize that for us, God wants to give us what we need, and the Spirit forms our character and sanctifies our minds and hearts. Therefore, as long as we abide in the Spirit, pneumic atrophy will not cloud us, but rather the love of Christ will become manifest in our lives. And we had one special thing. We don't have a video or a limerick. We have a pastoral haiku. Emmett, oh Emmett, thank you for that fun journey. Haikus are the best. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I might pass that on to Grace. I think she'll really love it. Thank you for that. Really wonderful presentation. I mean, it was a very complex article. To be fair, I'm very grateful that you drew out the theological and pastoral implications, because it's a descriptive article. She's writing as a historian. So the goal is to describe, but she'll not necessarily think about, you talk to her personally, she'll talk about pastoral implications, et cetera, but her article is focused on description, historical description. So I thought you did a wonderful job of drawing out from the historical description some of the pastoral questions that we have to ask. I would love to hear from our, not only our presenters, but also the class. So any comments or questions you have for Aaron and Mike on let's start with the Kristen Dumais article. So was this something you read or heard before, you felt before? And might I ask that I would invite the women in our group to speak first, and maybe we men can start off by listening, and then we can also add our comments a little bit later about, because I think I have two sons, story of two sons. One could fit, if you wanted to, the toxic masculinity model, and the other one doesn't. And that the one that didn't has always struggled in the church about, what does it mean to be a man when he doesn't like the same things that other people. He's not a sports person. He loves jazz music. So anyway, but I want to pause. But women in our class, did you want to be our first responders to comment first about the Kristen Dumais chapter?
I just have a quick question. So there's Wild at Heart. Mm-hmm. Does anybody know the female counterpart book? Because it's driving me crazy.
Captivating.
There you go. Yep. So that when my
there's a female I did not know there was a female.
It's called Captivating, and it's John Eldredge's wife that wrote it. And
they co-wrote it. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, they co-wrote it. Well, I only read like the first chapter because someone recommended. I have two daughters, and someone said, "Oh, you have to read Captivating," and it starts out talking about how they're princesses. And I can't remember the wording, but it was basically that if we're not raising them as this mold of being princesses, that we're not doing God's will in their life. And I have a frog catcher in her princess gown, and then I have like, don't let me touch a frog or a bug or a spider. Like I have two total, like what you were saying, Max, with your sons. And I just remember when I read it, I thought, wow. And I did like, so hearing all of this about Wild at Heart has really been eye-opening to me, because I never read it. I have daughters, and I was really I'm just glad I didn't read it, I guess. But I wasn't appalled, but it just didn't speak to me and Captivating in that way. But
Laura, someone gave my husband Wild at Heart, and that's the only reason like I knew about it. And we almost wonder if it was a joke, because you meet my husband and we're both, I'm an Enneagram 8, he's an Enneagram 1, so we're super justice oriented. We say we're raising, a third of the Supreme Court justices with our 3 daughters. Like, no way, man, right? No way. He and I were talking about Wild at Heart specifically, but then also the toxic masculinity in general. And I just think we have such a low opinion of men in the church too. Like, what are we teaching the dudes? You know what I mean? Like, the whole die to yourself piece is completely lost. And I think Dumais does a really good job of deconstructing that as well. And that just really bothers me, because, I mean, I don't know. My husband feels like he's never even fit in finally our church, he feels a fit. He's never fit in evangelical church settings, because their men's ministries were like, you want to go hunting and drink some beer? And he's like, no, not really. Like, I'd rather go to a poetry set. Like, or like sit down and talk about feelings, because I have them too. So I feel like we have a really low form of men and women in the church, and we're not asking people to die to themselves enough when we get into the toxic masculinity piece.
I thought it was really interesting to have the combination of the what does it do to masculinity, and then what does this do to femininity? Because it feels like we're almost, when you read these two things next to each other, it feels like Eldridge and kind of his cohort is trying to move back to what the kind of Greek paradox or paradigm was. Like, the men are very active and the women are very, inactive. They receive, the men, and like that kind of imagery. It seems like they're almost trying to go back to that because they feel like they're losing power. I thought that was what is this doing to both understandings of gender?
Amy, you were starting to say something. Just wanted to give you room for that.
Yeah, thank you. No, something that I kind of hoped to see in the Jesus and John Wayne article, and maybe it just didn't fit here, I'm not sure, but was really the perspective of Jesus, like people, those who participate in toxic masculinity, or those who find themselves in that place. What is their view of Jesus? Because it's been my experience that their view of Jesus is the Jesus that returns and the revelation Jesus. And I guess I kind of hope to see a little bit of that in this article, that because I don't know, I think who you believe Jesus is, if I think that's where toxic masculinity really comes from, to be honest. Like, when you fall off on one side or the other of who Jesus is. I don't know if that's making sense, but that's been, we were in Mark Driscoll's church, full disclosure, it was wild. So that's our takeaway from that experience, at least from pulpit teaching, is what was so missing all the time. As we like sat there like thinking, what is happening here? That was what was missing. And what left room for then this type of masculinity. So
I think what's striking to me, and Amy, that's powerful. My group members in this class, we've had a lot of conversation about the impact of Mark Driscoll, but yeah, I guess I think I think what part of what's compelling to me about all of Paul's imagery, so like I'm even going back to like last week when we talked about Paul being like, I'm not going to take money for being, like a rock star speaker in Corinth. Like, I'll be a tent maker. Like, at every turn we see Paul taking the lower position socially, gender. At every turn he's modeling this upside down kingdom. And I had another thought, but it was escaping me, connected to what you were saying about Mark Driscoll. I think some of us, depending on where we span the generations here, like I was triggered reading this article by Kristen, and we have to remember this is one chapter in a whole book, right? Like, we have to keep that in mind. Like, I haven't read the whole book yet. I've listened to a lot of podcasts on her, and on her book. So maybe she gets into some of these things that we're asking. I would have liked to see more of this or that. Maybe she gets into that in other chapters for those that have maybe read the whole book and I haven't. But I can totally see the arc, like even for my husband and I, who we got married in the late 90s. And like, when I think of what was swirling in the church environment, and my husband would be more like Tone's husband, he's like, I don't own a gun, I don't want to hunt. And like, at every turn, I feel like there's this like masculine mold being put on me and it doesn't fit. And what is your picture of Jesus, right? And so I don't know, I just feel like Paul keeps like taking every opportunity to say, I'm not going to be the rich guy, I'll be the tent maker. I'm not going to be the strong man, I'm going to be the nursing mother. I'm not going to be that. Like, at every turn, Paul is modeling for us the upside down kingdom, and that to me is really compelling.
I would just add, because I'm old enough to add, that I feel like I've lived through this. This has been part of my story. So these books are books that were part of what everybody was doing, and it was super bothered. Like, it really bothered me deeply to think about the culture I was immersed in, I think, for so many years. But I think it also made me say, what are the cultural messages that we're listening to now as the church? What are even the voices that some of us trust as Christian voices, what is it that we're listening to now? Because if so many people could be so influenced by these authors and what they were saying, I don't know. It makes me nervous, quite honestly. And I've got the gift of prophecy. So sometimes, yeah, truth comes out.
I will say that if you read the whole book, she's a modern church historian, so that's her job. So she's going to trace this as a historical movement, origins to development to consequences. So that's the strength of the book. Every now and then she does talk about how people swimming in these views of masculinity read the Bible, and it turns into a vicious feedback loop. They read an affirmation of their toxic masculinity in the Bible. I don't think she uses this particular example, but just random as an example, like David beating the Goliath, So, and then if the Bible affirms the view of masculinity, then it kind of basically becomes a biblical basis to champion it. So there's a vicious feedback loop. It influences the way you read, and then when you read it, the Bible affirms what you've already embraced. So it takes the fallback of spiritual casualties, unfortunately, to awaken the church that something's really wrong. And I think we're unfortunately riding the ripple effect of that right now, and it's just the beginning. I mean, we're hearing how this has really damaged not just. I mean, the most victimized group is basically women. I mean, this has been an occasion of abuse. But we also have men who they themselves have been not formed spiritually well because of this, and they have wrong views of leadership, and there has to be a little bit of deprogramming. I would just simply add to the men that she ends the book by not saying, this is the biggest critique of the book, but it wasn't the book's purpose. So it's a little bit of an unfair critique. She can't offer a positive view of Christian masculinity. She says that all she can do is map the bad version. And and raising red flags and alerting the church, it should be the job of the church now to rethink, well, what does it mean to, what does Christian masculinity look like? And I personally feel like maybe we should first talk about what it means to be, a flourishing human being in Christ, a person first. And then we can talk about the specifics of what does it mean to be a biological male and a biological female? As a presenter shared, that we were created male and female. So we're not going to really understand what it means to really be human until male and female share and understand one another well, and the gifts and the perspectives that are brought in. And that gives a fuller picture of humanity than if we were to isolate ourselves by any kind of role like toxic masculinity and simply just live our entire worldview from that. So I'll stop there, but I wanted to move the conversation on to the other article in our time remaining. So I shared already what I thought was really helpful for Grace Emmett, just to see that Paul wasn't bound by Greco-Roman roles of masculinity. That gives me a model that whatever my views of masculinity are, I don't have to be bound by what the world out there tells me masculinity is. But others, comments, how would you pastorally appropriate Grace Emmett's work, since she has simply given you a description of masculinity in the Greco-Roman world, and she's leaving that pastoral work for us, the reader, to do? How do we pastorally appropriate this? We had some really good suggestions from Aaron and Mike and from Jeffrey. Would you add to it, expand on it?
I know our group's not going, but I would definitely point her to anybody to the Lee article to address Emmett's article. I think the Lee article does a really good job of addressing the Emmett. So they really complement each other well.
We're talking about Dorothy Lee and her view of women in ministry.
The Dorothy Lee article, I think, goes really well with the Emmett article.
Okay.
Pastorally, especially.
Okay.
The maternal imagery that Paul uses.
Do you want to give us a little highlight without giving away the whole show, since you're going to present next week?
I know, I don't want to like give a full presentation, but I mean, she talks about like several times throughout the article. I mean, she talks about how people would be surprised at how not misogynistic Paul is in his writings. And she points to his reference of, you know, his use of female imagery to actually show vulnerability and his sensitivity in a world that was so masculine and patriarchal that it really was countercultural. And she uses those same texts that Mike and Aaron use to talk about, you know, pregnancy and labor and nursing mothers, which I thought those two articles really complemented each other.
I guess one thing that connected for me, again, thinking back to last week, like in the same way that we saw Paul go one step further and say, I don't want to just be a pedagogue. I want to be a father who's in committed relationship to you. Now we see a feminine version of this where Paul is like, I don't just want to be your authority or the guy who, you know, moved you in a new direction. Like, that is vulnerable imagery to be like comparing himself to a nursing mother. Or I appreciated how Emmett talked about it wasn't just that he compared himself to a pregnant woman as though she could procreate, but the emphasis was more in the image of laboring. So I'm going to guess there's a good handful of us on this screen who can speak firsthand to what the difference between that is. There is a very big difference between I'm pregnant and being in the process of labor. And I think that's really personal imagery. So guys, like, I don't discount you for not being able to personally know what we mean by this, but that is powerful that Paul would even think to choose that imagery. Or like, you know, she pulled out things like they're having latching on problems, or that breast milk is best. A few of us were talking before class offline, and I was like, we need to invite the La Leche League to this class tonight. Like, there's just some powerful things here that Paul is pulling from. And it's not just about like, let me reinvent your view of women. He's doing something really actively powerful in how he refers to groaning in labor and birthing and nurturing and breastfeeding. And like, yeah, it's pretty tactical, messy, vulnerable stuff. And I appreciate that. I think to hear him doing that in the same way he did last week with, I don't want to just be a pedagogue, I want to be a father. That's powerful.
Yeah, he's not embarrassed by any of this imagery. In fact, he promotes it forward as a positive image of how to practice leadership. Forming leadership in the church, leadership that forms people. Great. Any other comments? How would you appropriate Grace Bennett's work for pastoral ministry in a positive way? Or if you had questions, maybe it's some things of the article you want to ask a question about.
Well, yeah, Max, I just wanted to comment. I thought Grace Emmett's article I want to read it again. I probably will after class because, you know, I've read the New Testament so many times and those images never stuck out to me. They just kind of went right over my head and I can't believe I missed them. And so I think just even highlighting it for folks in our ministry context, it's really important. And so just to even bring it to the fore, I think is a good step for some of us.
There's a previous book, and she referenced it, and I don't know if she referenced it in an article, but I know she referenced it in her dissertation, which will be published as a book. But Beverly Gavanta wrote a book called St. Paul, Our Mother. And I think that's, in the history of New Testament scholarship, that book started it. So all of a sudden, she opened up an entire research area that people weren't thinking about. So Beverly Gavanta wrote a book called St. Paul, Our Mother, and that's another book I would strongly recommend.
I would love to double down on what Tone and Amy said, just like bringing this imagery forward. I think the lack of representation is what women often like subconsciously we tell ourselves we're less because like femininity is not it's not in scripture. And so, I mean, this was something I ran into at summer camp. Like a lot of the stories and imagery that was used for our students to learn from, it was all masculine and male dominated because it was the big stories of men doing the big things, you know? And so every week I sat with campers that were young girls asking, well, why aren't girls in the Bible? Is God a man? Like, aren't we less because God is a man and we're women? So it's like, you have to know that the lack of representation of the femininity of God and the representations of women in scripture is important, because it subconsciously tells women that like we're less because we're not represented.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think related to the field is not just re-examining maternal images and images of the female that are appropriated positively in the Bible, but also examining minor characters, quote unquote minor characters whose stories are not heard, but if you listen to the text carefully, they have a story to say. And so when we listen to or read works, it's not just Isaac, for example. There's a story with Ishmael and Hagar, along with Sarah and Isaac. So these are some of the new work that's being done. And I think a lot of that hopefully will be appropriated well so that we can have a richer understanding of the Bible and its world. I would love for us to continue, but I think we actually made time. So this session actually blazed by fast. Thank you so much for the rich conversation. I know we didn't cover everything. I want to thank our two presenting groups, and also our third presenting group is up next. Just a quick a note, just so you know, this Friday I'll be leaving for San Antonio. I'll be coming back in time for our Tuesday night session, no worries, but I'll be at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting. So if you email me, I might not get to it until the late hours of the evening. And I might defer to wait until I come back. If it's an emergency, I'll definitely respond. It's just that I'm going to be locked into a conference schedule from morning to night. So it's only in the gap times I could respond to any correspondence. So can I ask that those who are working on the next presentation next week, so the Women Ministry group, we already talked, but the Human Sexuality New Testament group, that's group G, group G, if you could stay behind, we could talk a little bit about what to do. Everyone else, you're dismissed. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for a great conversation this evening.